Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the various news items we have this week are the approval for the Pfizer vaccine, which has now moved from a preliminary or emergency approval to full approval. Naturally, anti-vaxxers have moved the goalpost in an attempt to thwart this new development. A chiropractor has been accused of deceptive practices when trying to sell stem cell therapies as a miracle cure. Australia produces yet another terrifying development in their animal species, where giant centipedes have been hunting down birds and eating them. These and other news items can be found at the timestamps given below. Let's begin with the FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine. Apart from giving it a weird name, the development of the Pfizer vaccine moving from emergency approval to full approval isn't all that surprising. What is surprising is the way the anti-vaxxers have responded, saying that the change from emergency approval to full approval doesn't really affect anything, and yet for a long time they've been spouting nonsense arguing that since it's not a proper approval, it hasn't really gone through the same rigorous testing. Well, no, it went through exactly the same rigorous testing. The difference is they didn't have longitudinal data. Longitudinal data is nice to have, but not essential to prove something is safe. Now, instead of simply arguing that it was an emergency approval, it's the fastest approval given to date. And yes, it's also one of the most well-funded developments in treatments in a very long time. The fact that so many governments pushed so much money into getting a vaccine for the CCP virus is why clinical trials could be run as large a scale as they were, as frequently as they were, why companies could afford to invest in developing drugs and vaccines that would have no end result. They were getting funding for this that they otherwise could not have afforded to do on such a large scale. This is why the approvals have occurred when and how they have. The FDA had all the data needed, they just had to churn through all of it, and since they had all their preliminary data, they could issue an emergency approval. They could then follow up with the full approval in due course. There is one major criticism coming out of someone named Doshi. They have a range of arguments that the Skeptical Raptor goes into in more detail. For the most part, it circulates around the issues of how effective is the vaccine and is it effective against the Delta variant. In short, we know from the available figures that it remains effective against the Delta variant. Admittedly, that efficacy wanes, but that's not all that surprising. There's also issues that they complain about how the clinical trials were conducted, and things about the vaccine review panel. None of these are really all that relevant. In fact, some of them are outright deception. Overall, it's been demonstrated that the vaccine is effective against all variants. Admittedly, to a certain degree it's lost efficacy, but nothing that wasn't unexpected. The safety has been demonstrated on a very large scale, in fact across entire countries like Israel. The fact that we can give boosters mitigates some of its waning efficacy, and the remaining issues are often either non-issues or ignorant of certain facts. The vaccine's increasingly important when more and more people are being hospitalized due to infection by the CCP virus. No matter how you look at it, the Delta variant is infecting more people across a wider breadth of the population. Thankfully, at least at the moment, those in the older age groups have already received vaccines and are somewhat protected. This leads to them having less severe infections. That doesn't protect younger people who haven't yet been vaccinated. This is what's happening across the board. More younger people are winding up in hospital. Even if the older individuals aren't experiencing as severe infections, they're still experiencing infection to some extent. This is where a case study of a man in his 70s losing vision in one eye becomes very relevant. It's not the most severe of symptoms, death being the obvious frontrunner there, but there are other things that could have happened. Long-term heart or lung damage, immune diseases, the list goes on. What happens here is interesting not only because of what it is, but how they think it's happened. The men began with the general symptoms of the CCP virus, a runny nose, and then a few other symptoms followed along. He was given the diagnosis of CCP virus after this occurred. After seemingly recovering from the CCP virus, he came down with a severe headache about a week later. Following this, vision in his right eye began to fade. That's a very fast loss in vision, and there was also severe pain. This matches with other reported studies where the CCP virus has led to impaired vision. What exactly was happening was only elucidated after a CT scan, and that showed that the sinuses had become inflamed, all the way down the right side of the face. This was also affecting the bone and involved a lot of other problems. It was so bad that they had to go into emergency procedures and perform surgery. The patient's story then gets even more complicated, where they found that there was a bacterial infection at play. Following this, they applied antibiotics, the obvious solution to a bacterial infection. But further investigation found that this wasn't going to work as well because there was also antibodies, specifically the IgG4, in the area. And this has a whole raft of issues that's associated with, particularly autoimmune conditions. The IgG4 is what seemed to be related to the rhinosinusitis, or the inflammation of the sinuses. After being given the combination of antibiotics, steroids to knock down the immune system, and the surgery, the patient seems to have recovered. And while the specific relationship between the CCP virus and the loss of vision isn't as clear, there is a relationship between the presence of the IgG4 and viral infection killing immune cells. These are your cytotoxic T cells. This is yet another possible and possibly likely, given similar other case studies, of long-term side effects from the CCP virus that create a complex network of side effects, comorbidities, and complications. Next, we have the news about the chiropractor who's in trouble for peddling stem cell therapies. Oftentimes you'll find chiropractors selling all manner of suspicious, if not outright snake oil, solutions to everyday problems. Subluxation is perhaps the most common, a non-existent and imaginary condition which is supposedly the cause of all problems. Supposedly, treating that subluxation will be the panacea to your life. Well, in this case, they've taken a step away from their quackery as it stands to something even more questionable. Trying to claim and then sell stem cell therapies. Stem cells have a very narrow use at present, and it has very narrow use for a very specific reason. You need to know how to use it, where to use it, and be able to control its application. Something a chiropractor is certainly not capable of doing. As there isn't a lot of evidence yet to support the specific application of stem cells as a treatment for conditions, and the clinical trials that are being conducted have yet to be able to provide a definitive methodology, claiming they can treat anything specifically isn't exactly going to get you very far, unless you make those claims and don't bother to tell anyone about these drawbacks. That's where the lawsuit against the chiropractors involved comes in. They made claims, various claims at that the treatments could deal with things like arthritis, osteoarthritis, nerve damage, joint pain, and pain from injuries. A lot of these are really not suitable applications for stem cell therapies at the moment. Worse yet, the chiropractors claimed that the treatments were equivalent to established and proven therapies that are known to work. Importantly, therapies that have approval from the FDA, something stem cell therapies don't currently have for these particular applications. And this is why the Attorney General for the state of Georgia, is taking them to court, going from a human slime ball to an animal slime ball, specifically cane toads. Cane toads are a particularly nasty species of creature. You can think of the Hypnotoad from Futurama and you'll have a good idea as to what sort of danger they are. In Australia, they're even worse. They were introduced in the early part of the 20th century in an effort to combat a particular beetle that predated on the sugarcane. Rather than deal with the sugarcane beetle, they began to attack other things, more or less becoming a relatively strong predator in that environment. This was because there was no predator to the cane toad themselves. Today, some species are increasingly getting better at dealing with the cane toads, notably magpies, kookaburras, and other native species to Australia. But still, there aren't enough predatory birds and other species to be able to deal with the cane toads. How then does the cane toad get controlled? Part of it is that the Australian government has programs to stop their spread. Even with those programs though, they continue to spread out from the areas they were introduced to in Queensland, gradually spreading out west and south. Some of the reasons that a cane toad doesn't have any natural predator and why they're able to spread so well is that they produce toxins within themselves. This makes them, at best, unable to be eaten by predators, and at best, actively dissuades them from even trying to kill them. This is not true of the cane toad tadpole though. The tadpoles are increasingly turning on each other and eating themselves. These acts of cannibalism continues on into adulthood, where the mature cane toads are eating each other. In a highly competitive, limited-sized pond, and in a limited environment, both the tadpole and adult cane toad predating its own species make sense. And this also explains why there is an increasing movement for the cane toad to spread out its environment much quicker. This explains why we're seeing increasing speed of transmission of the cane toad from areas where it's currently identified to new areas. And in fact, there is some evidence that this is even changing the behaviour in how they travel. In other Australian animal-related news, we have giant centipedes that are eating birds. Fortunately, not fully sized birds, but rather baby birds. There's a part of Australia called Phillip Island, but there are also a number of other creatures there, notably the 30 centimetre or 1 foot long giant centipede. These giant centipedes have large claws and they can inject a venom into their victim. The rather disconcerting description we have is that the centipedes strike as the chicks rest, scraping away the flesh from the back of the baby bird's neck, injecting them deadly poison, and eating them alive as paralysis sets in. Yeah. Australia. Thank you for yet more terrifying nightmare fuel. What is even more worrying is that while the seabird chicks account for some of their meals, approximately 8%, about 48% of the total intake was from vertebrate animals. That means there's another 40% that aren't just seabirds. The final news we have for you is somewhat astronomical in nature and regards claims by SpaceX that they could be returning to the moon before 2024. We now have a number of private companies trying to compete for the ability to deliver people to the moon and then further on. Currently, the plan is at least to get them into space, primarily the ISS. Between delivering astronauts and other equipment into space, these companies are getting quite a bit of funding from NASA and other countries. From here, the long-term hope is to be able to go even further out, recreating some of the earlier achievements of NASA, and then hopefully going beyond those achievements. A slight hiccup to this process was a lawsuit between NASA and Blue Origin by Jeff Bezos. with that somewhat sorted out, NASA has approved the funding or continued funding of SpaceX and their ability to create a system for delivering astronauts to the moon. One of the advantages that SpaceX has at the moment is that its rockets, and specifically its Starship, are at least somewhat further along in the development pipeline, and so their ability to modify them, as they have intended to for this, means that they can achieve the desired milestones that much sooner. So the claims from SpaceX and Elon Musk in particular seem to be a summary of the fact they've resumed funding. Their equipment may be able to be more easily modified, and that they currently have some success to speak of. At the same time, though, they are carrying some baggage in the form of failures, equipment that's not yet ready and possibly may not be ready in time, and other minor hiccups that are cause for concern. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.